Hi folks, Canadian Prepper here. Quick update for you today. We got some breaking news. Things appear to have taken a major turn for the worse. Something major has happened in the last 24 hours. I'm going to talk about 4 of those things, which are all pointing towards imminent escalation. Now, we have Russia amassing 18 bombers. This is according to Western intelligence, all open source intel. Satellite imagery confirms that 14 Tu-95 and 4 Tu-160 strategic bombers are being loaded with approximately 300 missiles at Engels Air Base. Now, it's presumed that these are going to be used for a major bombing campaign in Ukraine, which will likely, if successful, be the biggest campaign to date, priming the grounds, of course, for the major Russian winter offensive that, according to a lot of independent journalists on the ground in Ukraine, is likely to take shape before January 1st. Now, the reason why this is so concerning, by virtue of the fact that these are strategic, that is, nuclear-capable bombers, this is instantly going to put NATO and our nuclear forces on a much higher state of alert. So don't be surprised if you start seeing a lot of military activity, if you start seeing transponders going off, if you're watching the flight radar. This is big. At the same time, we're seeing Russian Tu-95 strategic bombers landing in China for the first time. So this is clear-cut, explicit posturing intended to send NATO a message, I think. It's known that one of the indicators of imminent escalation of a nuclear conflict is the placement of bombers, the loading of bombers with weapons. And so is this just being done to posture? Is this being done as a diversionary tactic, subterfuge, misdirection on behalf of the Russians? We don't know. I guess we're going to find out in the not so distant future. It's likely that the movement of the strategic bombers to China is sending a message to NATO that the Russians, just another testament to the Russian-Chinese alliance. They've been running a lot of joint sorties into Japanese and South Korean airspace in the last 24 hours as well. So things are heating up. Now, that in and of itself is concerning, but that's not even the whole story that's going on here, okay? Something big is happening. There's been a complete breakdown of talks with respect to strategic arms control between the Russians and the United States. Recall, they were planning on going back to the negotiating table to talk about the reduction or inspection regime of each other's nuclear armaments. This is a long-standing agreement that they've had in place that ensures that, strategic arms are kept controlled and they're kept under a certain amount with the hopes of hopefully, getting rid of them all someday. That is no longer a thing. Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has confirmed the complete breakdown of these talks and that they've been postponed indefinitely. Russia has withdrawn from the negotiations, saying that they're not going to negotiate until their conditions are met, one of which is that the United States stop arming the Ukrainians. Now, what's going to happen if they go through with this major bombardment, which is likely going to be the nail in the coffin for Ukraine's critical infrastructure, sending millions of refugees to Poland? There's going to be a humanitarian outcry. NATO is going to be obliged, and they're going to have all the justification they need to send fighter jets, send Patriot missile systems, send long-range HIMARS, tanks, you name it. I think that's all the justification they're going to need at that point. So whether this evolves into a immediate nuclear incident or not, which I don't think it will, I want to emphasize that, this is a major inflection point in the conflict. This coming bombing raid and the subsequent winter offensive that follows will be the deciding factor in the conflict. If the Russians are not able to take the territory that they need for their national security interests, because this is an existential war for them, then this is going to escalate to the nuclear level. If they run out of conventional munitions and they have a stockpile of 5,000 nukes and they have to choose between the complete economic breakdown and humiliation of their society, they're likely going to choose the nuclear option, if only to send a message. But Sergei Lavrov today has said that if this war gets conventional between the United States and the Russians, then it's likely going to immediately go to the atomic level. Now, there's been some other information that has come out. Russian Defense Ministry has banned public discussions of the mobilization. Okay, remember a couple days ago where we were quoting Ukrainian intelligence that suggested that the Russians were going to be mobilizing up to 5 million men? Well, this corroborates that, because now the Russians are saying, you can't talk about this or else you risk prosecution. So they're basically preventing people from having any discussion of weapons, troop deployments, mobilization, and anybody who's found to be doing so will be deemed a foreign agent. and subject to, going to jail, basically. 60-point federal service order includes banning of discussion of the size of the Russian force and mobilization. So recall a few days ago I made the argument that playing the devil's advocate for Ukrainian intelligence, like we do with Russian intelligence, because we both know they're FOS, that means full of shit, for you guys who don't know the acronym. Basically, in the Vietnam War, you had 3 million guys cycled through the meat grinder, okay? And at any given time, you only had about 300 to 400,000 of those guys fighting. I think the peak was around 400,000. So what that means, if we're talking about a protracted high-intensity conflict, which is much higher intensity than what the Vietnam War was, in terms of the casualty rates already that they've incurred, we're talking, by some Ursula von der Leyen slip-ups, potentially in the hundreds of thousands of men, definitely hundreds of thousands of casualties, but quite possibly hundreds of thousands of actual deaths. You're talking about a cycling of troops that would require a substantial amount more than the Russians are claiming with this partial mobilization. What this all means is that the increase in military spending next year in the Russian budget, I think they're going to spend 1/3 of their GDP on weapons. This partial mobilization is just the first leg of an obvious full-scale mobilization. We've been saying that all along. So expect that this initial wave of soldiers that you're seeing with the Russian mobilize is just setting the administrative infrastructure up to make a conveyor belt of sorts. Because if this war goes on for a long time, you're going to have to, give these soldiers tours of duty. You can't just have them in there forever. They're going to get burnt out. They're going to get shell-shocked, all the rest. So that's what's happening there. I just find that very convenient that they've now banned public discussions of mobilization right around the time when people were starting to get suspicious that the mobilization is a lot bigger than they're saying it is. As I previously indicated, Moscow has said that there are no possibilities for nuclear talks until the U.S. stops arming Ukraine, which we know is simply not going to happen. A lot of people that think that now that the Republicans have the House, that they're going to start to waver in their support for the Ukrainian war. But all the Republicans want is a track record and an audit of where the weapons are going. Okay, you'll find that there's unanimity amongst Republicans and Democrats when it comes to whether or not they should support the war at all. Just they have a different strategy for how they go about doing it. So yeah, we're in this to win this, as they say. Poland apparently wants to annex Western Ukraine, according to Russian foreign intelligence. So we just talked about Ukrainian intelligence. Let's talk about the Russian intelligence end of things. They claim, Russian intelligence that is, that Poland is preparing to have a referendum on the annexation of Western Ukraine. Now, here's what I foresee, just to simplify this, because I don't have much time, got to take my kid to karate class, and that is, quite frankly, more important than doing videos like this, but they may not be if what we say actually turns out to be true. But I will say that it seems like we're going to see a Syria-type situation, a balkanization of Ukraine, which is, right now, it's very simple, okay, because you have NATO versus Russia. But it's very likely that you're going to see some fighting within NATO, be it Polish versus Ukrainian nationalists versus Russians. I think we're going to get ourselves into a little bit of a love triangle like that pretty darn soon here. They're saying that the Russians may actually turn a blind eye to this if the Poles allow them some sort of land corridor to the Kaliningrad exclave, the Suwalki corridor. I'm not going to get into all the details of that, but they're basically saying the gist of it is that the Russians might be okay with the Poles annexing that part of the country. Now, recall that Germany wants to put Patriot missile defense systems in Poland. Poland saying, we don't really want them here. Can you just send them to Ukraine because we don't want a target on our backs? But maybe this is how they're going to be able to pull off a no-fly zone, is if they make some sort of back-channel deal with the Russians in ensuring this passageway into Kaliningrad. But of course, this might create a rift in NATO, and it might not go over well. But I haven't really polished my analysis of that particular aspect of things. Anyways, I talked about Sergei Lavrov. He spoke at length about the breakdown of communications between East and West, and he also said that even if our Western neighbors became interested in somehow restoring joint work on European security, restoration will simply not work. The United States, in the last 24 hours, has mulled, they haven't committed to, but are mulling, and this is now public, the training of 2,500 Ukrainian troops per month. this is kind of a moot point because they've obviously been training them so far, and there's apparently inspectors on the ground in Ukraine, actual U.S. military on the ground in Ukraine doing audits of the weapons to make sure they're going to the right places. So we're starting to see us getting uncomfortably close to Russia's red lines, and it appears that this thing is just going to get out of control. I mean, they've stopped the nuclear talks. They're putting bombers in China for the first time. They're signaling to NATO that, hey, we're loading our bombers with missiles. Do you get the point? In addition to that, you have these embassy bombings that are taking place throughout, I think it's Spain, but in many other embassies, they're on high alert as well. And they're not bombs. I think there were flares. One was a bomb, but there's a lot of other ones now that are flares. Anyways, of course, they're going to blame these on the Russians, and they very well may be being done by the Russians. But regardless, what this is all going to do is cement Russia as a state sponsor of terrorism. And we already know that the European Parliament has deemed Russia a state sponsor of terrorism. Now, this isn't binding, so that means that individual countries within the European Union don't have to necessarily act on it. They're not obligated to act on it in any way, but it's a symbolic first step towards a formal declaration of war by the Europeans against the Russians. Okay, and these terrorist acts at these embassies are only going to move us closer to that. Ursula von der Leyen had come out yesterday and claimed that 100,000 Ukrainians had died in the conflict. Died, not casualties, and they walked it back later on. They went and scrubbed the video. They took it off of Twitter. They edited it out, and then they reposted it, and everybody was like, okay, come on. You should have just said you made a slip up instead. Now it really looks like the Ukrainian casualties, not casualties, but the Ukrainian deaths are at 100,000, and the casualties, which are typically in war 3 to 4 times the amount of deaths, so you're talking about 400,000 to 500,000 casualties. Now, Ukraine started with an army of 400,000 to 600,000, plus they drafted a crap load of guys. So you imagine that if what she's saying is true, then they're struggling for manpower. And I don't know how the hell their hospitals are not overloaded. I mean, that's way worse than what COVID could ever do to the hospital system. So anyways, they immediately walked it back. And conveniently, today on Western media, Newsweek in particular, they came out and they took the claim that the Ukrainians make that the Russians have lost 90,000 guys, 90,000 deaths, as fact. Okay, they published that like it's a fact. Of course, they say that this is, the Ukrainians who say this, and then they later on in the article they say, the United States estimates are much, much lower in terms of deaths. But that's all about the headline, right? Because that's what a lot of people are going to read. So I just find it cute that on the day that she comes out with making that blunder, Newsweek comes out and tries to say the complete opposite. Regardless, lots of people are perishing in this conflict. This is a very high-intensity conflict, probably the highest intensity since World War II, easily, if not even worse in some cases than World War II. I mean, the trench warfare of World War I, it was bad, but I would venture to say that there were some battles that have happened thus far that, the concentration of deaths and casualties has even been higher. And recall that in World War I, the line didn't move that much. So I'm not surprised to see this, what appears to be like a stalemate. And this is trench warfare as well. But I think if the Russians can take this Bakhmut and they can break through the line there, then we may well see a collapsing of the Ukrainian military forces. But it's hard to say at this point. The Russians, I think, they came out yesterday and they said, we destroyed one HIMARS system. That's the first I've ever heard of one of the HIMARS systems being destroyed. They're very effective at shooting down the HIMARS missiles, but that's the first actual, documented HIMARS death that I've seen. So, if that's the case, then they got a long way to go. And that means that the Ukrainians still have a lot to bring to bear as well. Regardless, things are just heating up all over. I mean, you got Estonia and Lithuania pushing for a lower oil price cap, and these Baltic state countries are very hawkish on Russia. The Latvia's foreign minister has recommended that Ukraine should be free to strike within Russia. Okay, so Latvia has already deemed Russia a state sponsor of terror officially, meaning that they're effectively already at war. So you know that right now they're in it to win it. I mean, they're going for broke. So they're just saying whatever, to try to get NATO involved in the conflict because they know that inevitably Russia is going to be probably banging on their door. Belarus is signaling that war is imminent. I'm not going to get into the details of that, but basically an article that came out today, a spokesperson for the Belarusian government came out and said that tensions are escalating. We don't think war is going to happen tomorrow, but it's looking like it's kind of right around the corner type thing. You had China and Russia, who are doing joint sorties, made very close incursions into South Korean and Japanese airspace. They didn't cross into their airspace, but it was airspace which was international. But I think they call it the Korean Air Defense Zone. So it's a place where it's customary that you identify yourself and what your intentions are. And I guess they didn't do that. And that created a bit of tension. This, of course, on the same day that Russia's sending bombers there. So have Russia extended the nuclear umbrella to the Chinese? Is this all just a flex, this bomber stuff? I don't know. But it looks very strange. And those two things in particular, the arming of these bombers explicitly in broad daylight for NATO to see, and the ceasing of talks on strategic arms reduction, those two things happening on the same day is very concerning. Let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. Canadian Prepper out.